Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference. We are wrapping up day one. We have one more session after this, but very excited with how the conference has been going so far, and we're very excited to have you here for this conversation. So thank you for joining us. The conference, the Affordable Housing Conference, features local, state, and national experts that lead conversations exploring challenges, sharing best practices, and coalescing us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. This year's theme is focused on building stability, and each session is spotlighting unique approaches to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. I'm Danielle Hubley. I'm our Advocacy and Education Manager, and our additional PSC staff here to assist you today is Kylie Goslin, our Executive Director. So if you have any challenges or tech issues, don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. We're here to support you. You can also join us. We've been live tweeting the conversations and we'll continue throughout the next 2 days using the hashtag CAHC 2022. And you can follow us via our live tweeting on Twitter at PSC Housing if you aren't already. Next slide. Today's session, where you find yourself now, is housing access and higher education with a wonderful team of speakers who I'll hand it over to in a moment, but I want to quickly thank some of our sponsors. So first and foremost, thank you to our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, La Rosa Building Group, Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. And thank you so much. We couldn't do this without you. Same goes to our collaborating sponsors, Bank of America, Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, KeyBank, and some of the other ones that were listed there whose names left before I could finish reading them. Supporting sponsors, all of their information is available on our website if you want to go check out their work, but we couldn't do this work without them. So thank you so much for your support. And last but not least, in terms of sponsors, today's session was sponsored by the Leviticus Fund. So thank you so much for sponsoring today's session. And a few quick housekeepings. First and foremost, we have our I-Forum coming up next month, Tuesday, December 6th. It is focused on tenant-based subsidies in Connecticut and equitable expansion. This I-Forum is going to feature an overview of tenant-based housing subsidy programs in Connecticut, who accesses these programs, the deep positive impact housing subsidies have on households' quality of life, and how we can work to ensure equitable expansion of housing subsidies. This is going to be a great conversation for policymakers, service providers, developers, advocates, municipal officials, and tenants, as we work towards ensuring everybody has access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. So we hope to see you there. We'll drop a link in the chat for you to register for that. A quick few housekeeping items, and then I will pass it off to our team. The session is being recorded, and all recordings will be made available as soon as possible following the conference on our YouTube channel. All participants are muted at present. Please stay on mute unless a speaker has asked you to unmute. If you have any technology issues, again, myself and Kylie and any of our PSC team on the call are available to help you. We'll do our best to assist you in live time. And your speakers will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. So without any further ado, I'll pass it off to Amy Dowell. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Welcome to our panel, Housing Access and Higher Education. I want to thank and congratulate the Partnership for Strong Communities for hosting another successful and informative conference, and we appreciate being included very much. I'm Amy Dowell. I'm the Director of Education Reform Now Connecticut. We are the state chapter of a national nonprofit organization. We operate as a think tank and a policy advocate, promoting great educational opportunities and achievement for all by increasing equity, protecting civil rights, and strengthening the social safety net. I have had the pleasure of working with my co-moderator today, Sean Bradbury, the Senior Director of Government Relations and External Affairs for the Connecticut Colleges and Universities, on a variety of issues around access, affordability, and high standards and supports for post-secondary education in our state and our students. And according to the Connecticut Youth Count 2020 survey by the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, 18% of all homeless or unstably housed youth in Connecticut under the age of 24 were enrolled in college courses. We know that access to stable housing is essential to academic success for students, and that housing for too many in Connecticut is out of financial reach. This is not a new problem, and the profile of housing insecurity and access has certainly increased over the last few years. But what does this look like for students, and what solutions can help us improve? What do we do? While we don't fancy ourselves as housing experts here on this panel, we do know that if we want to graduate a workforce that will sustain Connecticut's ambitious pipeline goals, fill needed roles in fields like nursing and teaching, and make our state more welcoming to families and students from other places, we need to get to work on making housing more affordable and accessible. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will use the last remaining time to answer as many as we can. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean and the rest of our excellent panel to introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Amy, as always. As Amy said, I'm Sean Bradbury. I'm the Senior Director of Government Relations External Affairs for the Connecticut State College and University System. So for those unfamiliar with CSCU, we are Connecticut's public system of 12 community colleges, 4 state universities, and our state's online institution, Charter Oak State College. I'm really excited that we brought this panel together because, as Amy said, we are not housing experts. I assume most of you that we are speaking to today are much more experts in housing than any of us are. We're higher ed experts. We're the wonks and the nerds who like to talk about like the transformative impact that higher education has on our students and the communities that we serve. And, we're here really today to shine a light on the issues of how the overall housing crisis has really had an outsized impact on higher education, both the students that we serve, the communities that we serve, our faculty, our staff, our students collectively. It is a real issue. And as Amy said, if we want to retain top talent in this state, if we want to make sure we're providing a nurturing environment for our students, a safe and supportive pathway to social and economic mobility for all of Connecticut's residents, housing has to be at the forefront of everything that we're talking about here. I will stop rambling on here too much about how much we all are passionate around these issues and kick it over to Dr. Duncan Harris and Mark Perlsman to introduce themselves.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Duncan Harris. I'm the CEO of Capital Community College. As Sean alluded to, I may not know that much about housing, but I have worked in our state's community colleges for the past 26 years. And so I do know a lot about our students and some of the challenges that they're facing, housing being one of those. And so looking forward to sharing an innovative model that we develop here at Capital that we're beginning to scale for the state with the Department of Housing and CHR. So glad to be here today.
Thanks, folks. Thank you, Amy, Sean, and Dr. Harris. I'm Mark Hulsman. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice, which is housed at Temple University. And I'm glad I get to be, the fourth person to cop to not being a deep housing person on this panel. I come from, obviously a higher ed perspective on these issues, and have been a longtime advocate on issues of college affordability, debt, and racial justice in higher education. None of which you can talk about without talking about housing affordability and housing instability among students. So incredibly excited to be here today. If folks have heard of the Hope Center before, you've probably heard of us through, we're best known for our surveys on student basic needs and security, which I'm happy to talk about in a little bit here. We sort of advocate and study the intersection of student basic needs, including obviously housing insecurity, and higher ed access and affordability. So excited to dig into some of what we know and what we're trying to do to change what we know on these issues.
Okay, well, then I think it makes sense to start with Mark right now, so he can give us sort of the aerial view of what these surveys have been telling us, and sort of give us more of a national perspective on sort of housing insecurity and what colleges across the country are doing to address these needs. Sure,
thanks, Amy. I'm happy to go. I mentioned at the Hope Center, we study a range of basic needs and security issues facing students. And there's a pretty common theme across areas like housing insecurity, food insecurity, sort of, broad financial burdens facing students. And it's that students tend to be particularly at a disadvantage in overcoming, what we know in this case is a nationwide and growing housing affordability crisis. And students are often left out of the conversation, particularly at a state and federal policy perspective when we think about these issues, right? There's a baseline assumption that many federal and state decision makers have, that students in higher education are by and large, well off, that they're doing okay financially, they're less in need of sort of our policy attention or different interventions to address various economic challenges, or that they get enough financial aid to sort of cover what we know is a growing burden in terms of housing or living costs, and we know that's not true. So the price of higher education broadly, the cost of attendance, including tuition, but not just that, including non-tuition costs, has become far greater of a burden on families, and the aid that students has been getting has simply not kept up. And this is a story, in Connecticut and elsewhere, about state funding for public colleges, which has sort of stagnated or declined over several decades, and not just increased prices for students, but put institutions at a disadvantage because they need to sort of maybe delay infrastructure or housing projects, rely on debt financing, right? As sort of college enrollment up until the pandemic and demand for housing has really outpaced the availability of available affordable housing that students can access, both sort of on and off campus. So the Hope Center has been looking at this sort of on an annual basis for several years now. Our most recent survey was fielded in the fall of 2020. So we've got one in the field coming up. But we had responses from over about 200,000 students across 200 institutions nationwide, 2- and 4-year institutions. And we found that housing insecurity and homelessness in particular is widespread and consistent. It's particularly acute for students at community colleges and HBCUs nationwide. And there are populations like parenting students, LGBTQ students, students of color, Black and brown students in particular, who face pretty widespread housing insecurity. In fact, nearly half of all students in our survey had experienced some sort of housing insecurity, and 1 in 7 at both public 2- and 4-year colleges experienced homelessness. So that's a pretty consistent figure. That's not just a pandemic era thing. And the homelessness figure in particular jumps to 1 in 5 students at HBCUs has experienced homelessness. So this is not a small number of students at the end of the day, and it really flies in the face of a lot of assumptions that we see at the federal level that these are not, this is not a population that really deserves our immediate and urgent attention. So, maybe I'm going to sort of provide a little bit of more of an overview in a minute. We can talk about some of the ways that public policy has not kept up and the programs that actually specifically disadvantage students in a bit here. But maybe it's, sort of worth talking about the self-evident impacts of this. Amy mentioned in her opening remarks that, housing insecurity and basic needs insecurity are sort of inextricably linked to student success, right? It's not rocket science to say that without a stable place to live, it's hard to prioritize schoolwork. It's hard to study. It's more likely to lead to, stress and anxiety, and things that can keep students from succeeding while enrolled in school. But there are also sort of knock-on effects to housing insecurity among student populations. For one, students facing housing insecurity may feel the need to take on more hours of work just to be able to make rent that month, which we know further reduces the time they have to study. There's good evidence linking, students working, far more than, a part-time job and their inability to sort of stay enrolled. They may take on more debt, right? Student debt is a thing I think a lot about, spent a lot of time working on over the past several years. And because students can borrow for any piece of a school's cost of attendance, housing insecurity can sort of, indirectly increase the debt that folks are taking on and have to pay off over a longer period. We know this impacts certain populations more than others. So the inability to address this is sort of impacting sort of basic notions of equity in our higher ed system, preventing student success, impacting the racial wealth gap in the long term, things like that, for as long as we're unable to sort of like deal with mechanisms or create mechanisms, sustainable mechanisms to address it. So I'll stop there. Happy to sort of provide more, nuggets of information that we've seen in our surveys, but more or less we see that housing insecurity as a problem among students, particularly at community colleges, HBCUs, and others, is widespread and consistent as an issue.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. I think that was really like helpful to see like where we're actually seeing this, how it actually reflects within like our student body, and like just seeing those raw numbers is really powerful. So I think coupling those numbers and those jarring statistics we were seeing from you, Duncan, would you be able to walk us through like how does this typically present for our students? Like what are you guys seeing as boots on the ground, as community college students? What does housing insecurity and homelessness look like for our students, and how does this impact like marginalized groups, like our students of color, like refugee students, our LGBTQ plus students? Like how are we actually seeing these statistics and these raw numbers that are jarring actually reflected in the students that we serve here in Connecticut?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sean. And building on what Mark shared, I think we've pivoted from taking great pride in terms of community colleges anyway, and being an open access institution, to pivoting to really success, and what's impeding our students' ability to be successful and complete the degrees and move on to acquire jobs and or transfer and what have you. As I mentioned, I've been in the space for quite some time, and at the onset, we were glad and focused in on fall enrollment, but we didn't focus on the end part of that in terms of completion of the degree and the credential, which allows them to get a job to provide for themselves and their families. And so big pivot, right? And so I think unpacking what some of what Mark was sharing is that when you look at the non-cognitive factors that are impeding students' ability to be successful in school, they certainly could do differential equations, but if I haven't eaten in 3 days, right, that doesn't make any sense. If I'm trying to complete my nursing degree and I do not have sound transportation, as another barrier, and of course, what we're talking about today in terms of housing and an ability to complete a degree, in terms of the Maslow's and kind of those hierarchy of needs. Our average age at Capital is 28. Right. So I think about what I was doing at 28 years old, and those are the conditions that my students find themselves in, and in terms of having to pay for housing, and that being top of mind for them. And unfortunately, sometimes students do what I would do, which would be to perhaps study less, work more to pay rent. Sometimes there are issues at home where there are safety concerns, which would require somebody to move. And so we've leaned in and taken on housing as a part of our student success strategy. All right. And so that's not mission drift for us. I do not, once again, profess to be a housing expert, but we did partner with the Department of Housing, which are housing experts and are as concerned as we are about individuals in the state's ability to have safe and sound housing opportunities. And so we locked arms with them, along with a behavioral health community health resources, CHR, and we formulated a program to lean in and address some of the housing insecurity challenges that our students were and have been facing, as one strategy. You mentioned certain groups. Capital is one of the most diverse schools in New England, and so of course, some of the things that impact the city of Hartford certainly impact the students that we serve, and housing being one of them. And so, once again, this program with the Department of Housing has been a model where we're able to provide short-term housing stability for our students in terms of, I don't know if you wanted me to go a little bit more into that at this point, but to shore up their housing situation, which once again, I certainly could not focus in on a nursing degree if I'm couch surfing or concerned about providing stable housing for myself and my children, which is, the profile of many of our students here at Capital.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're interested, Duncan, that'd be great to just give us a little overview of that program that Capital's been working on with the Department of Housing. And I appreciate you mentioning that, this is not mission drift for us within higher ed. Like, this is part of the core needs that our students have. But I do want to say, because it will sound oddly self-serving for you to say, that it is it speaks as a testament to the size of and scope of this problem for our students that like higher ed is kind of entering this arena right now.
Yeah.
While it's not mission drift, it certainly is budget drift, and it's coming at a time when our budgets are under probably the toughest challenges that we've seen in decades in higher ed, as Mark alluded to it with the lack of growth of state support over the years. That there's piles of money sitting around for you to address this. So the fact that you're undertaking this right now really, I think, speaks to how bad the problem has gotten for our students, that we're spending these precious resources and time on something that's kind of outside of our wheelhouse.
Yeah, I think what's been required though is a creative approach to addressing the problem, right? And so my student is Steve Delala's client also, which could be CHR's client. And so you've got this human in the middle that we all care about, equally, and we're all coming together, locking arms to provide them with support. And so with the program with the Department of Housing, basically they've provided us with funding to support up to 10 students a semester with rapid rehousing services. And so that shores them up for 6 to 9 months. I guess one of the examples that we had a nursing student last fall who was about to graduate, ran into a situation that compromised her housing, and 3 semesters in, 3.5 GPA, has a job in nursing waiting for her. But she did what I would do, which is put her housing situation for her and her children top of mind. Thank goodness we were able to kind of get her into the program. We were able to provide her with an apartment for up to 9 months, which got her through the spring. She actually exited out of the program because she, upon graduation, was able to secure, full-time employment at a local hospital, which thus provided her with the finances to be able to have sound housing. And so what we've worked with in terms of CHR is the mental and behavioral health entity that manages kind of the support of students seeking the housing. They go through a program, they do all the vetting. DOH has the funding. This isn't, once again, this is a part of their mission, and they had funding to do exactly what this program is doing in terms of providing individuals with stable housing to shore their life circumstances up until they're able to provide the housing for themselves, which is what we're doing with this program. And so, once again, such high stakes. We have these students who are close to completing their degrees. And sometimes all it is 6 to 9 months of support, enough time that, as Mark alluded to, that I don't need to start working, pick up an extra job, which causes me to not be able to make it through a high demand program like cybersecurity or nursing, et cetera. And so that's, one of the approaches that we've applied. I know that some of my colleagues on the West Coast, they're actually, building dorms and things like that the community college movement on the West Coast, perhaps, in terms of how they are approaching it, is to actually stand up dorms at the community college campuses. And then one of the other innovative approaches that we've been deployed in the state is that there's a partnership between Housatonic Community College and Gateway Community College and Southern University, where they have some dorm space that they weren't utilizing. And so we were able to form a creative partnership where community college students, that had compromised housing situations were able to utilize the dorms at Southern Connecticut. And so I wanted to send a shout out to our colleagues, that we're looking at it in that way. And so just a few of the options, but as we mentioned, it's not mission drift. And this is certainly one of the reasons why students find themselves stopping out.
So, Dr. Harris, you mentioned a project in California, and I think it's important, for inspiration and for, goal setting for a state like Connecticut, which is sometimes can be a little slow on the progress front, to talk about what some other states are doing that have meaningfully moved the needle for students. And so I'm going to ask Mark to talk a little bit about what he's seeing that has some promise in other states.
Yeah. So I don't know if they're, in looking at sort of policy solutions to address this problem, because housing insecurity is by and large or increasingly a nationwide issue. I don't know that we've seen a state that has this figured out, and I do not say that to be sort of glass half empty, but more as like a motivating tool for states like Connecticut, that policy experimentation and entrepreneurship and creative solutions, as Dr. Harris was alluding to, is a good thing. But I do think that there are some discrete state or institutional examples that show a lot of promise in helping us think about housing insecurity as a holistic way that can sort of create models that can build on each other. Particularly as some of these initiatives start, at fairly small scales, but can sort of can scale up, hopefully, as there's more budgetary light at the end of the tunnel. But we've seen partnerships, at the Hope Center, we've looked at partnerships that kind of leverage state funding, nonprofit resources, partnerships with institutions, or, maybe consortia of community colleges and others to subsidize housing for students facing housing insecurity. There are a couple on the West Coast that I think deserve some attention and positive scrutiny. One's in Oregon. It's called the Affordable Rents for College Students Program, or ARCS. And that program basically subsidizes the cost of rent by 50% for students who have experienced housing insecurity or homelessness, but also does other things in this process that I think we really can't underestimate that are barriers for students, and that's reducing some of the roadblocks and administrative burden that students can face in securing housing. So this program in particular not only, effectively subsidizes half of the rent for students, but it also waives deposits and application fees, gets rid of security deposits, right? You think of like the ability to cobble together 1 month's rent, but having a security deposit is a whole different story. Addressing utility and Wi-Fi's, not requiring guarantors or co-signers, things like that we know can trip up, particularly students experiencing homelessness, particularly students who are not, maybe as, who may be disconnected from family members, due to, an unsafe or abusive situation, right? There's a few models that are similar to this. One's in Tacoma, Washington. It's called the CHAP program, and I wish I remembered what that acronym stood for at this moment. I'm blanking on that. But the key seems to be providing both subsidies and vouchers for rent and reducing the administrative burden for students. There are other states that have really shone a light on the experiences of students facing homelessness and former foster youth and other populations. California, Louisiana, Maine, Tennessee, there's probably some others that have some policies that give priority to housing for students experiencing homelessness, both sort of during and between academic terms. So if there is available housing, that there's students are sort of, and there's a way to get them sort of towards the front of the line. So there's, discrete policies and practices that states have done to sort of, prioritize these populations and actually sort of, admit their existence, which I think is sort of a step further from where we were maybe 5 years ago on this. Two other quick policies at the state level that I think are worth mentioning that don't seem like housing initiatives, but I think are very connected to housing. One is emergency grant aid for students. So many colleges have built-in emergency aid programs, which allow students to apply for sort of immediate responsive grants to help them, address unexpected or costs or emergency bills that they face. And in fact, the largest federal pandemic relief spending in higher education came in the form of approximately $40 billion in emergency grant aids or relief to institutions that was required to be spent on emergency grant aid. And there was, another pot of money that was flexible, but that could also be used for emergency grants, the Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund. And there was just a recent report a couple weeks ago that came out that showed that half of students used some of these grants, for housing in some way. And all signs kind of point to the fact that emergency aid was transformative in helping keep students enrolled in the pandemic. Without it, we saw enrollment declines, but God knows what it would have looked like without this emergency aid. And so, we've seen this pandemic relief drying up at the federal level, but that doesn't mean that states can't step in or institutions can't step in some way. There are a few states that have their own emergency aid programs for students, Minnesota and Washington State. We think there's considerable potential to sort of learn what we've learned from the federal investment in emergency aid and have states help scale up these programs themselves. We're obviously advocating for more federal spending on emergency aid, but that doesn't preclude states from acting at the same time. And the last thing I'll say from a policy perspective at the state level is states can do a better job of removing these sort of barriers or kind of double jeopardy moments for students facing homelessness or housing insecurity. There's some really arcane and confusing stuff in the financial aid system that create a convoluted set of requirements for students. One is called satisfactory academic progress, which is a somewhat convoluted policy that basically require students to meet minimum academic or GPA requirements and continued enrollment over a period of time to keep their financial aid. In layperson's terms, it's like students, if their grades fall considerably or if they have to drop for part-time too long, they're at risk of losing their financial aid. Now think about what that means for a student experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness, right? Those are things that are likely, more likely for those populations than others if they have to work longer hours, if they can't make rent that month. It's the hierarchy of needs thing that Dr. Harris was talking about. So those requirements can be amended or appealed in some states. States like California have required colleges to take into account students' financial circumstances or like homelessness as a circumstance if before they're effectively revoking their financial aid. So there's things within the financial aid system that we can do at the state level to ensure that students experiencing what we know is a widespread problem don't also then lose their grants and scholarships, right? Which is going to severely limit their ability to continue in college. So yeah, I'll stop there. So there's like more housing, subsidizing rent, and fixing our financial aid and providing more flexible, immediate aid to students who sort of fall into a crunch making rent.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. I appreciate that. So I think a lot of those programs seem to be catered to a lot of our traditional residential students that are coming to regional comprehensives or R1s who are coming in from outside of that community into that institution. I think a really unique problem that we have is with, or unique subset is with our community college students who are overwhelmingly coming from the communities that their colleges exist in. These are, in Connecticut's case, we don't have residential community colleges. They're all from, the communities that we serve. So it's, their housing challenges can be unique. So I wonder, Dr. Harris, if you could walk us through what are some of the unique housing insecurity and general housing challenges that we have that we see presented in our community college students that we don't necessarily see in our residential students at the 4 years in regional comprehensives.
Yeah, I mean, I hearken back to, when I was an undergraduate, I was, kind of 18 to 22. I was able to live in a dorm, my meals were prepared for me, et cetera. And so once again, the average age of my students is 28. Right. And so you think about, the complexity of their lives, our students have to work, in most instances. And so, so those are all factors that roll up to, amplify the importance of us addressing kind of the housing situation that our students find themselves in. And so one of the things Mark mentioned, we do have a strong micro grant program here. And that micro grants, those are the emergency grants. Sometimes it may be that they need help with a month's worth of rent. Right. And part of my role is to reach out to my foundation to ensure that we have those funds in place. How students actually access the help, Sean, I think is tied to that. And so we've created an equity center. And the equity center is kind of a watering hole where students can go to find help. A chemistry professor like those of us like us on this call do not need to be experts in housing, but I do expect my faculty members to recognize that a student that may come in and present in ways in which they are distressed and may allude to challenges with housing in an essay or a journal, that they know enough to get the student to the equity center. And in the equity center, we have a navigator who's versed in housing resources in the Hartford area in the city. Whether that's short term or the process to get them involved with our DOH program, Also in the Equity Center, as Mark mentioned, we do have the Sun Scholars, which is a program that's designed specifically for foster youth. We have a number of them at our institution, and we actually house the Sun Scholar. They have a kind of an outlet there where we're able to connect those students in the foster care system to help them keep their housing, right? And so, the pressure that they're under already, et cetera. And so part of our strategy is to provide the support for students that are receiving subsidized housing to remain in there as possible. There's some neat software out there. We just got a grant to acquire a software system called Single Stop, which is specifically designed to, connect students with entitlements and other resources customized to the greater Hartford area. So, as a part of that, a student that mentions that housing is a challenge, we'd be able to gather that data and then connect them with, the resources in a more sophisticated way than me kind of going through an Excel spreadsheet to see, what partners that we have. And so we're deploying that as a part of the system right now. And, once again, when we did a survey of our students with regard to the number one reason why they find themselves, stopping out, and it was, financial. But when you unpack that, it's a myriad of things. Housing oftentimes being one of them, right? It could be childcare, it could be the number of hours that required to work, et cetera. And so once again, it's something that we've and I'd say just especially in community colleges, but we're leaning into in a very different way than we have historically in our community colleges. And I believe that and kind of feel that they're inextricably interlocked, right? And kind of the promise that we're making when we're admitting these students is that we're committed to supporting the whole student, and that those things don't, their housing challenges aren't left in the parking garage when they walk across the street into my building. And that I have, once again, it's not me, hiring a housing specialist, but it's me having a relationship with Steve at DOH and Heather at CHR. And then we kind of lock arms on support of my student, which is their client, which is their, Connecticut resident. So, so kind of in my mind, an exciting time, in terms of student success and what that means and what it entails. And it's, once again, it's just not limiting. And of course, our primary role is instructional, but these other kinds of things, housing being one of them, are a part of our mission.
I know Amy has the next question, but I just wanted to add quick, Dr. Harris, that I really appreciate the way that you framed that, because I think all too often we think siloed about the problems that our students face, and housing insecurity really highlights the fact that, especially for our community college students, they are all a piece of the pie. You have housing insecurity, food insecurity, taking care of childcare, your mental and physical health, all of these things that we tend to think about in separate pieces, and having that equity center that students can go to for a one-stop shop, I think is so helpful, because often it's not just one thing. There's a plethora of challenges that our students may be facing, that having that one-stop shop can be critical. So sorry, Amy, I just had to jump in and really just compliment Dr. Harris for the way that—
That's quite all right. I'm glad you said that. I did want to go back to something that you were talking about, Dr. Harris, about affordability. And, Connecticut, we see high numbers of students not completing their degrees. And we, compared to similar institutions in other states, even our neighbors in Massachusetts and New Jersey, we are more expensive, consistently to get a degree here in Connecticut than many of our neighbors. And what we recognize is that, this is this moment, this conversation around college affordability just broadly is having, it's having a moment. It's, the Supreme Court is debating it. We are, we have, a student loan program out of the Biden administration that's maybe going to continue, maybe not. So we're having a moment where this is becoming more and more top of mind, more and more central. People are understanding these issues more thoroughly. Could you both talk a little bit about sort of the double-edged sword of federal aid and what that means for students when they accept federal aid and how that can affect some of the other programs that are available to them? Because it is a complex road for students to navigate, and it sometimes can make them miss opportunities if they accept other opportunities. So could you just talk a little bit about that conundrum?
I can talk about one in particular, and I think you're exactly right, Amy. I think this before I sort of talk about sort of examples, I think this stems. It's really important to remember that a lot of this stems from a real misdiagnosis from federal and state policymakers in many ways about what students experience, who they are, and what the typical student experience is, right? And this sort of very old, inequitable assumption that being a student is not work, right? I think that there's, you see this in a lot of, maybe not always housing, assistance programs, although there are certainly some out there, a lot of other public, benefit programs that, a student attending college at a community college full-time or taking a full-time course load, that doesn't qualify as work, for students, right? Which is, given what we know about student experiences, given, personal experiences, that, there's very little sense, in that. But there is, again, this assumption that I sort of alluded to off the top in policy that's baked into many policies that, students attending higher education are just better off than other students. And we just know that's not the case. The data shows it's not the case. Talking to any student and being on any campus or around any campus will show that tends not to be the case. So, given that soapbox, I'll hop off that for a second and get into a policy where this is specifically reflected. One of which is the low-income housing tax credit. So, we know that housing insecurity and basic needs insecurity more broadly is particularly burdensome for certain populations, low-income students in particular, who may be 28, right, given the average age of students at many institutions, and have the income, threshold to qualify, who are otherwise qualified to live in low-income housing. But students, you cannot attend college full-time and be eligible to live in a low-income housing tax credit rental unit. That's a rule in law. There are some exemptions to it. It's complicated. They make some, they make some, flexibilities for part-time students, those receiving TANF, former foster youth, married students. There's a couple populations that still could live in low-income housing tax credit rental units. But if you attend school full-time, many students particularly, just have to either decide whether they're going to lose access to their housing or go down to college part-time, right? Like, that's a choice no student should ever have to make. And that's sort of baked into a federal program that's ostensibly supposed to address housing affordability for folks. So, there's several areas within, financial aid. If you drop down to part-time, then you may not be eligible for certain types of financial aid that's outside of the housing system. So students have to make these incredibly complex calculations about what aid they're eligible for or not eligible for, what they have to do in terms of their own housing arrangement. That no decision they should ever have to make, right? And they should be able to be focused on their schoolwork. We see in other public benefit programs, again, a little bit outside the housing perspective, but SNAP and food assistance. We know that students facing food insecurity are also more likely to be facing housing insecurity. The SNAP rules for students are incredibly complicated. There are some flexibilities that allow students to participate in it, but it's just a very tough thing to navigate. Students often are at the whim of whether or not their state SNAP agency is doing good outreach, right? Or if their institution has done good outreach, has a one-stop shop center for students to be able to access all of the public benefits and assistance for which they may be eligible for, and is sharing data, right? The Department of Education just this year allowed institutions or came out sort of, forcefully suggesting institutions use FAFSA data or financial aid data to, connect students with public benefits across the spectrum. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, and it's on institutions to sort of do that. Institutions that are already burdened by trying to do a lot of these other initiatives. So that gets a little bit far afield of the question, but I think that there's all of these little tiny areas of public policy that we're not swimming in the same direction on, and students have to make these really tough decisions.
Yeah, I don't have a lot on that, but a couple things. One, as Mark was talking just now, I think about Capital has the largest nursing program in the state. We have about 300, nursing students in the programs, and that's a program they're doing clinicals already, that are unpaid. There's a component with the demands and the rigor. They had all kinds of prerequisites to even get into the program, and so. Their inability to, work more to pay rent is a challenge. One of the things that's occurred in Connecticut, and shout out to our legislature, is that we do have, free community college, right? And the concept with our PAC program that, Amy, it doesn't necessitate, being eligible for financial aid in order to come to our schools for free. Thus, the thinking is if I'm not paying, this tuition, that would, allow more funding to go to, rent or other costs of attendance, right? Or your life costs that our students find themselves. The other thing that I'm very mindful of is the concept of, where students are working and the types of jobs that they're involved in, and what types of wages are, how demanding are they physically, that cause students to not be able to perform in the classroom. Also the idea is, as much as possible, of paid internships, right? I had I've got a number of companies that call me just about every week, and in my mind, kind of, sometimes depending on how the conversation, well, are you looking for free labor, right? My students, they need to work, and they're doing meaningful work, and they should be compensated for it. So as much as possible, we've changed our model to have apprentices and things like apprenticeships and paid internships, certainly, that cause students to not find themselves in a position where they're housing insecure as a result of not having money to pay rent or mortgages or what have you. And so those are some of the kind of strategies on the policy or student success front that we've deployed.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Harris. I appreciate you making the plug for PACT in there too, because I think that's been one of the most revolutionary programs that we've seen for our students, especially because it's a really student-centric program. You tell them it's free, just come here, we'll figure out the bureaucracy. You don't have to worry about piecing this together, we got you, but just get in the door and we'll figure it out. So I know I want to be conscious, we're getting some questions in the chat, so I just want to ask one final question for our panelists, which is, I think, we've seen there's a lot of the challenges to this are federal, and, the broader challenge itself is the state needs to fix the damn housing crisis and build some more housing, and that will kind of help everybody. But outside of that, we've seen some solution proposed. Last year there was I think it was HB 5136. It was this very large housing bill within higher ed that had a lot of things that was kind of had very good aims, and it identified a lot of the problems that we all know are the problems, which is identifying the students that are housing insecure, getting them the aid that they need, connecting them to services in the community, but it was all unfunded. And so I would like to kind of pose that question to our panelists. If you were looking at a new General Assembly coming in and a new biennium starting next year, so what proposals, would you put forward for either the legislature or the governor that can kind of, maybe not completely fix the problem, but at least get started on it within the housing insecurity challenges for students in Connecticut higher education?
Mark, you're the policy guy.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for,
So you're chomping at the bit.
I appreciate it. No, I think, it's a great question. And I think that, Sean, within the question or the lead up to the question, you mentioned, in some ways, this is fundamentally a resource issue, right? States need to, and Connecticut in particular, need to step up with the resources required to address what is a large scale problem, right? This did not happen overnight. The problem did not manifest overnight, and it is not a pandemic era problem. It's a long standing crisis, right? With just a lack of affordable housing for students and folks in many communities across the country. So, I think that there's there's no getting around the resource problem, right? Like states have to put resources into it. Now, so some states like California obviously has a housing affordability crisis on their hands, but they have done something in the last few years, particularly through state budgets and the state legislature, that I think deserve some scrutiny and replication, across other states. One is, there's a bill in California that would create, I believe, a $5 billion fund for no interest loans to institutions to develop affordable student housing. There's zoning issues and laws and things like that to overcome, but there's sort of like, a $5 billion loan, no interest loan fund to address the problem is resources, right? There's other incentive funds, around density bonus laws to build affordable units that, specifically for low income college students, and sort of improving the approval process around that, that again, I know California has looked at, and some others. I think that there's, again, removing any barrier that exists in state financial aid laws for students that keep students, that particularly disadvantaged students facing homelessness and housing insecurity. So the satisfactory academic progress, piece that I mentioned, ensuring that, I know Connecticut has a state that has thankfully implemented, a version of free community college, but there are states that have done fee waivers and other things for students experiencing homelessness, in terms of, both tuition and fees and in-state tuition for those experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity, right? We know, students may not have sort of residency in Connecticut, but maybe they can ensure that they're getting in-state tuition or free tuition in the case of community colleges. There's any number of things that you can do once you sort of, turn the lens on the fact that the problem is existing and widespread, which is maybe just a long-winded way of saying there's so many different interventions you can do, but it's going to require resources at the end of the day to do it.
So we only have about 10 more minutes left, and there are a few questions in the chat. I think two of them are kind of similar in spirit in terms of saying, are there programs that are stood up between communities where a community college is located or a college is located, where they have a partnership with the actual community that they're in for the creation of housing or housing assistance or subsidies. I'm not familiar with any of those here in Connecticut, but I would assume that Dr. Harris might know.
Yeah, we currently don't. I mean, so we're piloting the program with the DOH. I did see a comment in the chat about home ownership, and so we have done seminars and workshops with one of the community banks on educating folks on how to first-time buyer programs and things like that. But we don't have an existing partnership with a organization of that type.
Okay, and then there's one more about intergenerational living, and if there has been anything that we have seen here in Connecticut or elsewhere where that has been a success.
That's probably a Mark question. I don't know if that's been the best practice. I haven't heard of that. I know that we don't currently. Seems like a neat idea, though.
I haven't. I can't speak with authority on the intergenerational living pilot program, although it certainly is intriguing. I mean, I know that this isn't. I know that there are colleges across the country in certain cities that have piloted partnerships with local housing authorities to not just sort of connect students with subsidized rent and vouchers, but sort of housing students in housing authority managed properties and in the area, right? There's a ton of pilot programs to that. Not a ton. There's several pilot programs that I've seen, that sort of get at that, but that's connecting with local housing authorities. But that's the extent of that I know.
I don't know as far as like intergenerational, but there are as if we're talking about kind of innovative pilot programs that we've had, there's been a couple across like our CSUs that have been really interesting and entrepreneurial. One of them, Dr. Harris mentioned earlier, which is the Gateway and Housatonic at Southern programs that we have. which is, the challenges that we've had for enrollment that have led to kind of extra space in our residential halls at our CSUs have led to some interesting solutions for our partners for the CSU. So like Southern had space in some of the residential halls that they decided, we have space available. We have students at Gateway and Housatonic right in our backyard that are pursuing their associate's degree there, but they may have a housing need, they may be housing insecure, they may be homeless. Like, how can we provide not only a stable housing solution for them, but also, as an enrollment tool, a pipeline for those students to complete an A to B program between that community college and that CSU. And so I know that's been a success. We have a program like Central has the CARE program, which is built around foster youth and youth and adoption, that they provide year-round housing for those students as they're aging out of foster care, so that they, not only have a stable place to live, year-round, so including the winter and summer intersessions and any breaks, but that, they're also, there's a place close to home that they can maintain those community connections to. Eastern's had success with the Dream.us in building a similar program, but for undocumented students from lockout states. So you may have students from those states where they are, Connecticut, obviously we've had not only undocumented students eligible to enroll in our institutions, but they're eligible for institutional financial aid as well here. In other states are not as fortunate. They are, in the quote unquote lockout states, they are explicitly banned. So Eastern created a program where those students are provided housing here. And we also have a robust program for our own undocumented students that are here in the state as well. We have refugee programs for, particularly for, domestic and foreign refugees, post Hurricane Maria and a lot of the, tropical storms that we've seen kind of hit the southern United States. We've had programs welcoming students in from those states and territories. We've had students who are brought in from Afghanistan, from the Ukraine. There's constantly kind of like rehousing and housing support programs that we have for distinct groups that our CSUs are kind of these innovative labs for that. And these are students that are otherwise going to be, struggling to secure housing themselves out in the community. And so I think the more that we can find space for these students within our communities as we have space open up, that reduces displacement of folks out in the community that might be fighting for that other affordable housing. So I think we got another question here, going down a rabbit hole, but a program from the Netherlands here. I think, is this the, from Rebecca, I believe this is about senior and college student co-living spaces here. But we'll definitely check that out. But do we have any other questions from members of the audience? I think we have 4 minutes left, so we might be able to squeeze in one more if we're quick. Well, if not, any questions from our panelists, anything that you wish we had asked you, in the 2 or 3 minutes left, we'll give you the opportunity for shameless plug for any programs you want to highlight, any initiatives that you think are helpful for folks to know, resources that are out there. If each of you has like 30 seconds, what do you want to shamelessly plug?
Well, the shameless plug that I would give is that that we recognize our role kind of as a key cog in the educational and societal ecosystem in a very different way. I pick up the phone, right? And I don't think any one entity can do the work on their own. And so, we take great delight in forming this coalition of the willing that are in a place to lean into these challenges, right? And so, and that's childcare, that's mental and behavioral health, that's housing, that's food security, et cetera. And like I said, I started 26 years ago. It was a very different kind of landscape then. But we know, very clearly what our role is as it relates to, disrupting cycles of poverty and things of that nature. And that's where folks, what they can count on us for, at our institution. So it's good and noble work. And folks who have questions and want to, work with us, we're very amenable and excited about that. That's what you should ask me.
I do not have anything to add to that other than, I'd say 2 things, and I want to answer. There's one question in the chat about students applying for housing vouchers. I would but my answer creates like just sort of the broader point that I think it is what we are focused on at the Hope Center, which is we shouldn't have to ask that question, right? We shouldn't, there shouldn't be a question of whether students can or can't apply for housing vouchers, or whether students are a population that is disadvantaged by, just being a student and can't access some of the other supports that are admittedly not enough, right? That we know that, there needs to be much more investment in things like housing vouchers and rental assistance for students or for families across the country. And it's not that there's enough out there and students can't just get it. We need to grow the pie, but the fact that it's unclear what students are and aren't eligible for. So my understanding, and again, please don't pull me off stage left because I'm not a housing person, but students technically, there's students aren't totally shut out of housing vouchers, but there are severe restrictions on certain housing vouchers. One of which is that financial aid received by students, so Pell Grants and other aid for non-tuition costs, which students can use financial aid for non-tuition costs, generally counts as income in determining your eligibility for rental assistance programs. So that just basically unfairly disincentivizes students and supported families from seeking higher education. So, that's one of the many restrictions that I was talking about before, right? That like students, applying for or living in low-income housing, tax credit housing, can attend college full-time without jeopardizing their ability to stay in that housing, right? Or jeopardize their financial aid if they go part-time, right? So there's just all of these little rules that need to be fixed, and assumptions that need to be, and myths that need to be busted for, if we're going to address this sort of comprehensive problem for students.
So I just want to thank everybody for this very, very substantive conversation. I think it's a topic that doesn't get enough play, just generally, and aligned with the goals of our state and our state government around workforce and making sure that we are keeping people living here in Connecticut and taking jobs in Connecticut. I'm just really grateful for everyone's expertise today. And thank you. We need to continue to make college a value proposition for students, and unsurmountable cost and debt in housing insecurity are contributing to some erosion in the value proposition for students. So we are really grateful to have this conversation today. Thank you all very, very much, and thank you the partnership. You have anything else, Sean?
We're over time, so I'll just say ditto and thank you, Amy.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.